Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Bartkus. I'm the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum here in Washington, Connecticut. Today is January 25th, 2021, and this is Readings from the Archives. If you're new to our programs, we're fortunate to have a great collection of history papers that were written by residents of Washington, Connecticut, just about 100 years ago. And I select them, read them, and I will show you some great photographs that I found in our collection that correspond with the paper. And after the program, which will last about 30 to 40 minutes, I'll unmute everyone and we could have a discussion. Perhaps there are questions that you have of me, or perhaps you live in one of the houses that we're going to talk about tonight and have some more information to share. With that, I'm going to begin tonight's paper. It's called The Three Levitt Houses and the Levitt Store. It was written in 1920 by Mary Mitchell Turner. Levitt is a name one seldom hears in Washington these days, although the four original houses are still standing and play an important part in the life of the town. They are Mitchell Corner, the Rectory, the Corner, and the house directly opposite the Rectory, once the Levitt Store, now owned and occupied by Mrs. Simeon H. Mitchell. Sir John, the first Levitt to settle in New England, was born in Dorsetshire, England in 1608. He came to America at the age of 20, became a freeman in 1636, and settled in Hingham, Massachusetts. He was deacon, selectman, and evidently an active man in the affairs of the town. He was twice married and had 13 children, all bearing Bible names. Samuel, the first Levitt to settle in this little town, was a direct descendant from Josiah, the fifth son of Sir John. Samuel was born in Meriden, Connecticut in 1750. His father, David, moved to Bethlehem, and then young Samuel married at the age of 35 Lydia Wheeler, the daughter of John Wheeler. It is said that in 1 year he made enough money dealing in cattle and hogs to build the first Levitt house in Washington, now owned by Mrs. Simeon Mitchell. Samuel and Lydia showed wonderful taste in the building of this house, as is shown by a daguerreotype now in existence of typical colonial architecture, with its white paint, green blinds, and picket fence. Its interior with wide hall running from one end to the other, and large airy rooms on either side. If you visit the house now, you will find the carved woodwork in ivory white, which decorated the original parlor, and the wonderful blue paper in the parlor chamber. It is said there were 10 open fireplaces, 3 brick ovens, and 15 outside doors in the first Levitt homestead. Samuel I was fine-looking, patriotic, and a good businessman, accumulating considerable wealth, and was also a high liver. He was told by Dr. Fowler that he must diet and live on porridge. The doctor came in unaware one day and found his patient eating his porridge covered with sugar, spices, and a dash of brandy. He had his sideboard of choice liquors. He owned a wonderful white horse, and the younger generation used to amuse themselves by sitting on a fence across the road from Dr. Fowler's house, near where the parsonage now stands, and by clapping their hands to start the horse prancing about in his pasture. 4 sons and 1 daughter were brought up in the first Levitt house, namely Samuel, William, John, Rufus, and Silence. John and Rufus left the home nest for the city and became wealthy merchants in New York, while Samuel and William remained in the hometown. Silence, the only daughter, married Abijah C. Peet in February of 1800 and died soon after. Rufus married late in life, Annabella Howland of Flushing, Long Island, and made that his home and had a large family. John married Cecilia Kent of Suffield, Connecticut. They lived in New York, but spent many of their summer months at the old homestead. They had a large family, and with their nurses and maids, filled the big house to overflowing. The granddaughters still remembered about the wonderful old house with its big pantries and cheeses, and the Sabbath, which began at 6 p.m. on Saturday and ended at the same hour on Sunday, and the delicious cold lunches spread for the farmers about who came to church for the 2 long services, and how the children were not allowed to swing on Sunday night unless they had kept Saturday evening. One of the great-granddaughters is now the celebrated portrait painter, Miss Cecilia Beau, who has just returned from Paris, where she has been painting the portraits of some of the celebrated generals of the Great War. Her sister, Ernesta Beau, married Dr. Drinker, now president of Lehigh University. They have a family of 6 children and are doing a fine work in the university. William, the son of Samuel I, married Eliza Logan and continued to live in the first Levitt house. He was a merchant and kept a village store, which stood a little to the east of the house. He was a very erect carriage, a lovable nature, and a great favorite with all the children. His mother, a very aristocratic old lady, kept house by herself in one part of the house. She kept a maid to look after her. She was very critical of her daughter-in-law because she used so many dishes. William had 3 children, namely Wolsey, Lydia, and Rufus. The youngest son, Rufus, brought his young wife, Martha Tompkins of Kent Hollow, to live with his father and mother. They had 1 son who died at the age of 6. Soon after his death, Rufus went to New Milford in business, taking with him his father and mother, and it was in 1867 that this interesting old house was sold to Mr. Simeon H. Mitchell, who made additions to the house, changing much of its original architecture. It is still owned by his widow. Wolsey, the oldest son of William, married Jane Fowler, daughter of Dr. Remus Fowler, the village physician, known by the younger generation as Grandpa Doctor. The second, Levitt House, now the rectory, standing across Parsonage Lane from the first, was built in 1843 for Wolsey and Jane to set up housekeeping in. Lewis and Daniel Canfield of Washington were the builders, and the house was so strongly built on a granite foundation, it is a fine monument to their workmanship. Wolsey was in business with his father and was a postmaster for 10 years. There were no post office boxes in those days, but when the stage arrived from New Milford carrying the mail, the names of those receiving mail were called out over the counter of the store by Wolsey, whose genial smile won the hearts of all. Wolsey and Jane, with their 2 children, Helen and William, left their first home in Washington for Chicago in 1855. Helen was married there to Mr. Edward Andrews. William later went with his parents to Orange City, Florida, where he married Miss Hattie French. Jane Fowler Levitt, widow of Wolsey, is still living in Orange City, Florida at the age of 98, a great-great-grandmother. This second Levitt house was next occupied by Miss Salome Morehouse, daughter of Colonel Morehouse of Church Hill, a sudden change from the hospitable home of the Levitts to the childless, guestless house with closed doors and closed blinds, except at the back of the house where Miss Salome lived in solitude. There was a general rejoicing when the house was made alive by the presence of children and became in 1888 the hospitable home of the Reverend Dr. G. Spencer, his daughter, Mrs. Cape, and their 3 children. Lydia, the only daughter of William grew up in the first Levitt house until young womanhood. She was a tall, slender, graceful girl. She went away to boarding school at Albany and came home an accomplished young lady for those days. At 25, she married Abner Mitchell of Washington. There was a political split in the church in those days, and because a certain minister performed the ceremony, the Mitchell family would not attend, but the young sister of Abner, 12-year-old Helen, later Mrs. Earl Buckingham, was allowed to attend her only brother's wedding. Abner took his young bride to the house he had prepared for her, which is now occupied by Powell G. Seeley. The third Levitt house dates back much further than the second, but is called the third in this paper for convenience sake. It was originally a hatter's shop, but was made into a dwelling for the oldest son and namesake of Samuel I. For many years it was known as the Corner and is now owned by Miss Louise Van Ingen. This house was built by Lewis and Daniel Canfield, and the timbers came from the Levitt trees. The beams are hand-hewed and fastened together by pegs instead of nails. In the attic is a basket, which is so large that it is impossible to remove it through a door or window. One might imagine it was the one thing left from the hat shop. Samuel II owned a beautiful black horse, and he was a wonderful rider and a great hunter. A painter by the name of Stimpson painted a picture of this horse on an inner wall of the barn, and it still stands as a landmark and a joy to the children of the neighborhood. Samuel married 3 times. The first wife was a Hazen, and they had one daughter, Theodosia, who married David Farrand of Washington. Samuel's second and third wives were Logan's sisters, Julia and Sophronia. 2 daughters came to the second wife, namely Silence and Elizabeth. These sisters married Thomas Franklin Frank Brimsmaid. The first, Silence, was mother of Isabel and Silence. The second, Elizabeth, was mother of Samuel Levitt Brimsmaid. These grandchildren of Samuel II played a prominent part in the life of Washington. Isabel, known by everyone as Belle, married William J. Ford, who became the much-loved village doctor. They built the house next to the corner and named it Elmsford. Silence, or Silly as she was called, married Alpheus G. Baker, and they built what is known as the Baker House, owned by their children. Samuel Levitt Brimsmaid married Frances Bradley of Roxbury and was for many years connected in the business with his brother-in-law Alpheus Baker at Washington Depot. Samuel Levitt inherited his father's house known as Blythe Hall, now occupied by his daughter, Amelia, wife of Commander Frederick B. Colby of the U.S. Navy. The third wife of Samuel II, Sophronia Logan, was a very clever woman. She had one daughter, Julia, much like her mother, with an added refinement which won the hearts of all. She was born in the third Levitt house in 1834. She was married there and lived there all her life, but hers was far from a narrow life. She spent much of her girlhood with her Uncle John's family in New York and was educated with his daughters. She was a young woman of wonderful talent and graces. She married Dr. Jedediah Huntington Richards, who had been a member of the family of Reverend Ephraim Lyman, at that time pastor of the Congregational Church, and living in the parsonage which was built for him. Mrs. Lyman was a sister of Dr. Richards. Another sister of his wife was Reverend Dr. James W. McLean of Brooklyn, New York, mother of Mary McLean, who married Edward Hook Van Ingen. Soon after Dr. Richards's marriage, he was stricken with a severe illness which left him an invalid for the rest of his life. He was a man of rare gifts, and the charm of his talk and his humor made him the delight of his friends. He showed wonderful patience and cheerfulness through the 12 years of suffering and failing strength, and during all this time, it was the joy of his wife to devote herself and her home entirely to him. Not long after his death, the Chinese government sent its first installment of young students to the United States to be educated. These students were usually placed in the families of ministers. The Reverend Willis Colton, then pastor in Washington, being unable to undertake this charge, and Mrs. Richards consented to take 2 of them. Her friends had feared a breakdown of her health, and they rejoiced that her grief and loneliness should be relieved by the care of these Chinese boys. She devoted herself to their education, and they became as sons to her. She was often called Queen of the Corner and all Washington. She had no children of her own, but her love reached out to all children far and near. She was known and loved by them as their Aunt Julia. Not only the children, but the whole town loved her. Hanging in one of the art galleries of Philadelphia is a life-size portrait of Mrs. Julia Levitt Richards, painted by Miss Cecilia Bow, picturing her sitting in her colonial room at the corner, and it is well named A New England Woman. If the walls of these 3 Levitt houses could speak, they would have much to tell of the past life of Washington, for through their doors circled men and women from all over the land who helped to make Washington what it is today, a town of rare beauty and culture. There are a few footnotes, several pages in length, that I would like to continue reading for you that relate to this paper. The Levitt Store originally stood a little to the west of the house, built by Dr. Harry Stewart in 1912, and now owned by Fanny P. Brown. It faced the green, and the front was in line with that of the first Levitt house. It was built about 1790 by the first Samuel Levitt, and in it he carried on the business of a village store, which was continued by his sons Samuel and William, and by his grandsons Woolsey and Rufus, sons of William. An old ledger of the firm of Levitt and Son has been preserved. It was begun in 1795 and ended in 1799. It is in a very distinct and elegant handwriting, whose bold capitals stand out as clearly as if written yesterday. The first Samuel Levitt must have used the best and the blackest of ink, and his penmanship is rarely equaled nowadays. Rufus was the last Levitt to keep this store, and he did it in partnership with Truman H. Woodruff. When, in 1867, Simeon H. Mitchell bought the first Levitt house and the buildings that belonged to it, this store was included in the purchase. Through Mr. Mitchell's friendly interest in Samuel Levitt Brimsmaid, a great-grandson of the first Samuel Levitt, this store was moved to Parsonage Lane, enlarged, and made into a dwelling house for him and his bride, Frances Bradley of Roxbury, in 1872. There, their son, Daniel Bradley Brimsmaid, was born in 1873. After a few years, they left this house and lived in Blythe Hall, the house built by Samuel Levitt's father, Thomas Frank Brimsmaid. And Samuel Levitt's home until his death and still occupied by his family. The Levitt Store, then a pleasant cottage, was for some years the summer home of various tenants, until about 1905, when Mrs. Simeon H. Mitchell moved into it from the large house, the first Levitt house. Here, she sometimes entertained distinguished guests. Her interest in people and affairs, her quaint and keen New England humor made it a real pleasure to visit her. She took pride in showing her visitors her collection of colonial costumes and other curious relics of the past. The 5 children of Abner and Lydia Mitchell were born in this house, namely Fanny, Charlie, Willie, and the twins Matthew and Mary. Willie was injured while coasting one winter, and after a lingering illness died. It is with great shock to his mother, then in feeble health, and her death soon followed. Fanny, though only 14, was very efficient and devoted herself to the children. In the severe epidemic of diphtheria, which so many young children were taken, Mr. Mitchell's family was smitten with the dreaded disease. The baby boy was the first to succumb, then Charlie. Fanny rose from her bed while still very ill to minister to the needs of the others, and she too was quickly overcome. These 3 died within 3 days and were buried in one grave with one funeral service the day after Christmas, 1862. All Washington mourned with and for the bereaved father, who with baby Mary was all that was left of that happy family. The Civil War was in progress, and Mr. Mitchell planned to leave his little daughter in the care of relatives and offer his service to his country. But he was a man of such value to the community that the town felt that it could not give him up, and a committee waited upon him to persuade him to let others go who could better be spared. At last he yielded to their importunity and said that he would stay at home unless he should be drafted, in which case he felt that it would be the will of God that he should go. He was drafted in the very next draft, that of August 1863, refusing the offer of the town to send a substitute. He, with his friend and fellow townsman Cornelius B. Gold, drafted at the same time, was placed in Company B of the 6th Regiment of Connecticut Volunteers. He was unusually tall and strongly built, and in the long and painful marches of the regiment, sometimes carried his friend, who was slight and of frail health. Abner Mitchell, while carrying water to the men on the firing line at the Battle of Deep Run, Virginia, on August 18th, 1864, met his death at the hand of a sharpshooter. All who knew him would confirm the testimony of his fellow soldier, Samuel J. Nettleton, in his record of Washington soldiers in the Civil War, now in the Gunn Memorial Library. Quote, a whole-souled Christian and patriot, nearing the age limit, he would not send or accept an offer of the town of Washington to send a substitute. Drafted was his call to duty of service. Words cannot express the loss to the church and town of such a noble life and character, end quote. When Abner Mitchell went to war, his brother-in-law Rufus Levitt took little Mary to fill the place left vacant by the death of his only child, Charlie Levitt, who died in the same epidemic that took away his little cousins. She was brought up by her uncle and aunt, calling them father and mother, and being known as Minnie Levitt. Some years later, her aunt having died and Mr. Levitt marrying a second time, she came back to Washington and took her own name of Mary Mitchell. Later, she married the Reverend Herbert B. Turner, then pastor of the Congregational Church, who afterwards became the chaplain of Hampton Institute. Three sisters, known as the Mitchell girls, her distant relatives, not having any immediate heirs and being fond of her and her husband, their pastor, left to her their house on the road to the valley. It was for many years the summer home of Reverend and Mrs. Turner and their children, Ruth, Ralph, and Julia Levitt Turner. Now, in 1922, it is the property of the Church of Our Lady of Perpetual Help and is occupied by the priest, Reverend Bernard McCarthy. Our alumni who were at the school, the Gunnery, in the 70s, the 1870s, will many remember the coming of the Chinese boys Lok Young Chuan, later known as Wing, and Kum Chi Ong, who lived so happily under the guiding care of Mrs. Julia Levitt Richards in her lovely home. They were among the first group of boys sent by the Chinese government to this country to be educated. We remember the curiosity and interest awakened by their peculiar dress, manners, and speech, and the sympathy felt by all for the two little boys so far from home and unable to speak our words or understand them. We remember how eagerly they learned the ways and customs of American boys, though never forgetting the politeness of the home country. None of these fellows could have been better placed, Mrs. Richards giving her whole time to their instruction. They made rapid progress coming to the gunnery as day pupils to finish their preparation for college. Wing entered the Sheffield Scientific and Kum Chiong the Yale Academic. The latter was soon obliged to return to China on account of delicacy of constitution and is doing well there. The Chinese government became alarmed on finding that many of the students had become Christians and recalled them all before Wing had finished his course. In the war, which occurred soon after their recall, it was convinced by their brave and loyal conduct that they had learned only good in our country. Wing returned to America, practicing his profession of civil engineering for a time. He became private secretary to the consul in New York City, and by his knowledge of China and her needs and of American customs, made himself indispensable. He was vice consul for many years and would have been consul if he had been willing to accept the position. But as the consul serves only for a short period and is continually changing, he preferred the more permanent position. He was so faithful, so competent and tactful that he could seldom be spared from the legation, and so to our sorrow, his vacations were few and brief. How happy he was to bring his wife here in the first months of the marriage, which proved to be a lifelong blessing to him. She was welcomed to Washington first for her husband's sake, and afterwards loved for her own. None of the alumni who were present at the dinner of May 30th, 1908, will ever forget his charming speech, one of the best of the occasion. He loved Washington and the friends who always welcomed him here, and the dearest of all, the adopted mother who held him close in her great and noble heart, who advised him in every circumstance, encouraged every good work and worthy ambition, and comforted him in every anxiety and sorrow. Her death in the spring of 1909 was a sad blow to him, from which he could not seem to rally. He came back with his wife and spent 2 or 3 weeks that summer renewing old friendships and strengthening the precious memories of the departed friend, and bidding farewell to the home of his adoption. Alas, none of us realized how soon he was to follow her to the home beyond. A short fortnight after he left us with his wife, we saw the notice of his death in the paper. He had been stricken down by the hand of a poor wretch of his own country. The useful, noble life, the faithful servant of his own country cut off by a worthless vagabond. How can these things be? They brought the mortal body back to lie in our little cemetery, on our beautiful hillside, just where he had been sitting a few days before, overwhelmed with grief for the friend who was gone. With Masonic rites, honored by the presence of the council and others of his own race, amidst the tributes of his American friends, we laid the body to rest, realizing that God is our Father and all we are brethren. And with that, that brings us to a end of today's reading. The Three Levitt Houses and the Levitt Store by Mary Mitchell Turner, which was written and read in 1921. And with that, I am going to unmute everyone, and we can have a discussion about the paper that I just read. So you all should be getting an unmute signal, and you could turn your videos on if you'd like. And if anyone has a question, feel free to just shout it out or raise your hand. And if there's any comments out there, I see we have some residents who live in these houses, so maybe I see Peter's hand. Peter, I think you're unmuted. Do you have any comments about the paper or anything to add?
Stephen, you did a marvelous job, absolutely marvelous job. You brought it home to all of us who are so fond of Washington. As you know, we live in one of the Levitt houses, and the Jim the horse, what used to be in the barn of Samuel Levitt, and that became our garage about maybe 100 years ago. And then when we renovated our own house, we brought Jim the horse up into the front hall, piece by piece, with great care, preserved perfectly, and he will be in the front hall forever. But Stephen, thank you so much for the beautiful, beautiful job you did tonight. Very moving for us.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind words, Peter. And thank you so much for sharing a photograph of the horse, which you've so beautifully preserved inside your house, and of the very interesting basket in the attic, which I think still remains a mystery as to who made it and why they left it there.
Stephen, I might just add that when we did our renovation 4 years ago, we discovered two very interesting things in the walls. One was we discovered the original catechism of Silence Levitt, which she signed in 1827. And that's in our storage box. And we also discovered a girl's shoe inside the walls. And maybe we should not have taken that out, because in doing research on Connecticut building practices, we learned that builders often put a girl's shoe into the walls because that was considered to bring good fortune. Well, we still have it. Maybe we'll put it back into the wall someday ourselves. But these two things are interesting, and we feel very, very close to the former inhabitants of the house. And once again, you did such a beautiful job.
Thank you so much. And that's very interesting to hear what you discovered in the walls during renovations. And I think we might have seen a photograph of Silence tonight in the slideshow. It was very interesting to discover that we had so many photographs of these Levitt family members here in the Gunn Museum's archive. So it was nice to connect names to faces finally. And I had also heard about the good luck of builders leaving shoes in the walls. So I'm glad that you still have the shoe, and definitely keep it close to preserve that good luck that has been overlooking your house for so many centuries. Yes, David, question, comment?
Stephen, didn't the Turners sell their property to the Catholic Church for them to then build the current church, which was consecrated in 1940. And at that time, they were having problems finding property to build a new church at from people in the area because it was going to be a Catholic church. I don't know if there's any truth to that story or not.
Yeah, that's a good observation. So this paper today was written in 1921, so it predates the construction of the Second Catholic Church in Washington. It originally started in Washington Depot. It was a small wooden church where the Hickory Stick Bookstore stands today. And I think it was the 1940s that the stone church was constructed where it stands halfway up Green Hill Road. And yeah, I think you're right. I think the Turners probably sold their property to the Catholic Church. And I think I read somewhere that the rectory that stands there today is not the original Mitchell house that those three Mitchell sisters lived in. I think I read that it was in such rough shape that they pretty much took it down to the ground and built what is there today on the same foundation next to the Catholic Church. And there's that story that we hear, the rumors that Mr. Van Ingen and others owned so much property on Washington Green that the Catholics wanted to build their church up on the green, but they were not allowed to purchase any land, or they did not want to sell any land to them. So they did not make it up to the top of the hill where those who are closest to God reside, and they only made it halfway up Green Hill. It's one version of the story.
Stephen, I have a very interesting coda to that story. About 15 or 20 years ago, one of the former pastors of a congregational church, I think it was William Industrot, came across the road and said hello to us. We had never met him before. And he said, you know, the Catholics wanted to come up here on the green, but he said, we kept them downtown. So
there's verification to the story.
Comes right from the pastor's mouth.
Well, I think it's interesting that you know, the church on top of the green is the original established church, the Congregational Church, the meeting house. The next church down is the Episcopal Church, which was, you know, made it onto the green, and then halfway down to the depot is the Catholic Church, and then of course at the bottom of the
Right.
Green Hill was the two Swedish churches. So it was sort of interesting to see the line of actually, it sort of reflects when these different groups came to Washington too. As you go down the hill, and, you know, they came here at different times and brought different peoples here. And it's sort of interesting how, you know, it's like a progression going down the hill for all these churches.
It's really incredible to see how the religious history of Washington has evolved over the years with these different waves of immigrants who came here to this area.
Excuse me.
Yes. Anyone else out there with any questions or comments? I see that we have Susan McMaster with us, and I have to thank her because the photographs of the Chinese boy come from her, and her family had a very close friendship with them, and her family lived on Parsonage Lane as well. And I think, I'm sorry, Susan, if I got this wrong, that I think you're related to the Reverend Colton. I don't know if you could hear me or if you could, do you want to join in?
Yes, I grew up in what was called the store that was moved to Parsonage Lane.
Okay.
I didn't grow up there. I lived there for several years. That was my grandmother's house. And Willis Colton was my great-great-grandfather. But he was the reverend of the church, the meeting house, the first congregational church in the 1860s and the 1870s. That's when he lived in the parsonage.
Wow, it's incredible. And I think his son, I've read, was very good friends with Lock Wing, the Chinese boy. And I think also one of his daughters was a close friend.
He had several children, so I'm sure that's the case, but I don't know which one or ones. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it's really incredible that you had shared those wonderful letters that Lock Wing had written to your family and the
yeah.
photographs. It's really one of the amazing Washington, Connecticut stories, to have this international connection. Who would have thought that students from China were coming here to the gunnery, to Washington, Connecticut, I think in the 1870s, David, is that when the Chinese educational mission
Yeah,
took place? It's
yeah,
incredibly
yeah,
important.
yeah.
And they were sent to schools all throughout America, and we're just so fortunate that a few of them came here to Washington to the gunnery and interacted with the residents. And I just found it so touching to hear how Juliet Levitt Richards, who lived in Peter's house, took these Chinese boys in and raised them and fed them and educated them in Peter's house. Just
Mm.
to think all that was happening right there on the corner of Green Hill Road and Kirby Road. It's really remarkable. I don't think too many people realize that as they drive by every day.
Oh.
Yes, David.
I think there's a story about Wing learning some colorful English expressions while he was at the Richards house from some workmen who were there. And apparently his rather colorful English expressions that he used weren't quite proper, I think. I forget who it was the workman who was in the area who conveyed these colorful expressions to Wing, but apparently he picked up on them as a young boy and apparently got in trouble for repeating some of them.
Yes, I forgot about that story. There is another paper here in the archive that does talk about the some contractors who were screaming profanities while they were doing some housework somewhere on the green, and he heard those for the first time and picked them up quickly. And it's also a horribly tragic story, how he was murdered
He died.
and was buried shortly after Julia Levitt Richards had died herself. And if you go over to the Washington Green Cemetery, they're both buried right next to each other. It's an incredibly powerful story.
I'll have to see if the Newtown Bee has anything about that, Stephen, at newspapers.com.
Yeah, there must be more articles. I had one here. I think I showed you the headline. I think it might have been a New York City-based paper, but there was probably quite a bit about both of their funerals. Anyone else out there with any comments or questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves. I think I've changed the settings so you're free to unmute yourselves or show your
Stephen, a
videos.
little aside,
Sure.
through your kindness this summer, I proofread a book by a Swedish author called Rolf Johansson called The Swedish Tailor and Adventurer. And what's interesting about Washington, Connecticut in that book is that his grandmother spent several years here living in the house of Dr. Ford, which is next to ours, and at one point in our house too. So Rolf Johansson and his wife, who are great historians, I mean, absolutely avid about details and facts. They've made 6 trips to the United States tracing their ancestries. And that book is going to be out, quite an interesting read. And his grandmother actually lived in our house in 1907, 1908.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. I received Rolf's book today. I don't know if you can all see it here, but I highly recommend it. It's going to be soon available. It was shipped from Sweden and it arrived today. And it's a wonderful, great story that Rolf has written. and his grandmother Rosalie Johansson, who came here as a Swedish immigrant. Like so many who came to Washington, we had such a large Swedish population here. In 1910, 22% of the town's population were of Swedish descent. And so Rosalie was one of them. And she has a unique story, though, because she was one of the very few who eventually went back to Sweden. She didn't stay here in America. And she raised a family there. And Rolf lives there today. And he wasn't able to join this presentation live because of the time difference in Sweden. He's sleeping now, but he'll be able to watch the recording. And I highly recommend that you all check out his book, purchase it. There will be copies available here in Washington, and we'll be able to share that information with you. He's put a great deal of effort into it, and he's going to be doing a presentation for us, a lecture and a book signing when it's safe to travel. He'll be coming here from Sweden, hopefully maybe towards the end of 2021 or maybe 2022. Any other questions or comments from anyone out there? Feel free to unmute yourselves, turn your videos on, or just mention anything. I had another thing I wanted to bring up, and I added a couple more slides here. I find it remarkable how this house at 82 Green Hill Road, the first Levitt house of Samuel and Lydia Wheeler Levitt, how it has been transformed architecturally over the years, the amount of effort that went into it. So what we're looking at here is what it looked like, when it was built in 1790, with the store to the right of it, which is no longer there, which is now the house directly behind it on Parsonage Lane. Mm-hmm. And then this drastic, second Empire style renovation by Simeon Mitchell in 1867. He took the roof off and, completely, I guess, Victorianized the house. And then, I found this in the collection too. At one point, this is a booklet. It was a colonial rest home, I guess, in the early 1900s. We need to do some more research there. David, maybe you could find a newspaper article about this, but I guess, maybe, I don't know, if vacationers maybe boarded there or elderly folks lived there for a period of time. I don't think too many people know that it was a rest home. And then in 1940, I guess, Edwin, I'm going to mispronounce this, is it Fix, purchased the property, and he changed the roof back from the mansard style to the colonial revival gambrel roof, and trying to sort of restore the original look of the house from 1790. And then his daughter married Donald Chadwick, and it became known as the Chadwick House, I guess. Yeah. So it's just been a real transformation. I don't know of any other house in Washington that has been altered so much and so many times and is still standing. So it's pretty interesting. Any other questions or comments from anyone out there? I don't know if do we have this Susan who lives in the house? Oh yes, Susan, you're here. Do you have anything to share about the history of the house? Feel free to unmute yourself, Susan Schulman, if you'd like to, but no pressure if you don't want to. I'm curious if it's the interior of your house, if it has also been, drastically changed with these many renovations, or if it still has a look of the 1790 original house. But it's a beautiful home, and I always admire it when I drive by. Does anyone else?
Stephen?
Yes.
This is Susan speaking.
Hi.
Hi, my video is not working.
That's okay.
But I did want to comment on the decorations of the parlor.
Sure.
They are still there in the parlor. On the east side is the formal living room, and it has dental work all around the ceiling, and a very ornate colonial fireplace, and is just the most beautiful room. And then on the west side is kind of another parlor. And what is most interesting about it is that the dental work matches the dental work in the Congregational Church exactly. And it looks like they shared the same contractor or woodsmiths, so that it's exactly the same. I can sit in the parlor and then I can go over into the church, and and we have pieces of both in both places. So it's really very interesting. Another interesting facet of the house is when I bought the house, I think it was in 1998. I was looking at just, the various architectural elements, and there's a knocker on the front door. And I thought, oh, this must be the name of the former occupants. But actually, if you look closely, the name on it is Dunover.
Oh.
Dunover, 1940. So Mr. Fix obviously had a sense of humor because it says done over.
That's wonderful. I never knew that was there. Wow.
Yeah, but feel free to come up to the front steps and look at the knocker on the door. We also have found other kind of architectural leftovers that we found in the garage in the back behind the store. When we took out some of the walls, a plank that said that it was built by someone from Roxbury in 1940.
Wow.
He had left his name and the date, and that he was from Roxbury. We also have in the basement a granite or marble stone in the fireplace with the construction date. So we know it's 1790.
Wow. That's incredible.
And thank you so much for this wonderful presentation.
Oh, thanks for joining. Hopefully you enjoyed the photographs that I was able to find in the archive.
I loved it.
Terrific, absolutely terrific photographs.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much. And so we have two homeowners represented that we heard about their homes today. And the rectory, St. John's Episcopal Church Rectory, is the other Levitt house there on the corner. And so it's wonderful that these Levitt houses and the Levitt Store are still standing here on Washington Green today. Is there anyone else out there that has any questions or comments? Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourselves. Anything else, David?
Mary Mitchell Turner is the young girl who is next to Abner Mitchell in that one photograph, of course.
Right. So yeah, we didn't talk too much about them. And if all of you are familiar with the architect Reese Owens, who lives here in Washington, and his family, and Toppy Pickett, they are descendants of Abner Mitchell through Mary Mitchell Turner. And we have the collection of Civil War letters that Abner Mitchell wrote to Mary Mitchell and his family here in the Gunn Museum's archive, thanks to Toppy Pickett. And we did a wonderful project with Paula Krimsky and the Chappaqua 8th grade social studies classes a few years ago, over a decade ago, where they transcribed his Civil War letters, and they published a booklet, and they created an exhibit here at the museum, and they were featured on Diane Smith's Positively Connecticut for doing research, becoming history detectives and doing their research into this family. And unfortunately, this another horrible, tragic story of so many members of his family dying in that diphtheria epidemic. You know, we're facing this coronavirus pandemic today. There were so many diseases that Washington residents faced and unfortunately died from over the centuries. And diphtheria was the one that took so many of Abner Mitchell's family. And you could go and visit them. They're all buried right here in the Washington Green Cemetery. And I often go over there for research, and we have our annual Washington Cemetery tour at the end of October. And we sometimes feature Abner's story and his family's story. And I know Peter often walks across the street to visit the cemetery as well. David, yes, I see your hand.
And of course, Abner Mitchell's sister, Mary Helen Mitchell Buckingham's son, Elnathan Buckingham, changed his name to Mitchell because with the death of Abner Mitchell, there weren't any future members of the Mitchell family in Washington. So Mary Jane got her son to change his name from Elnathan Buckingham to Elnathan Buckingham Mitchell, so the name could continue on. And my mother had a friend who was a Mary Jane Mitchell, who was a granddaughter of this Elnathan.
Mary Helen Mitchell.
Mary Helen. Sorry, Mary Helen Mitchell. Sorry, I'm getting my names mixed up.
Thanks, Mrs. Babington. It's nice to see you. It's very easy to mix up all these family members, especially when they repeat their names over the generations. And the Mitchells lived in the Old Litchfield Road, sort of Wickham Road intersection area. You know, as I've done more of these readings and as we do research, it's interesting to see how these families sort of settle and stay in certain locations in Washington. So the Mitchells were there, the Levitts were at the intersection of like Kirby Road, Parsonage Lane, and Green Hill Road. And David and I have been recently researching the Calhouns, and they sort of were right about, Calhoun Street, but another cluster of them settled on Route 202, Litchfield Turnpike, near Rabbit Hill Road, and had a huge property over there and many houses. So it's interesting to see where these folks settled, and also, where they moved around throughout town and eventually across the country. These Levitts moved out west and eventually down to Florida. And I know there are descendants all over the place. We had some people from Colorado reach out to us who were descendants a few years back. And it's really interesting to connect with the descendants of some of these families that had first settled here in Washington. And oftentimes they have many great photographs and stories to share with us too. So it's always exciting. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Feel free to raise your hand, unmute your video, or just shout out if you have anything. And if not, I'm going to remind you about our upcoming programs. I see we're at our 1 hour mark, so this is usually when we wrap things up. And what we have coming up next is Washington History Club. That's going to be Tuesday, February 9th at 6:30 p.m. And the topic of discussion is going to be Washington Winters, Then and Now. So we'll be able to really reminisce about, things that were happening in Washington here in the winter, sledding, skating, skiing, things like that in the past, and what goes on today. So Dimitri is going to moderate this for us, and we're hoping for a great turnout. So there's a different format for that. Everyone will be unmuted at the beginning, and we encourage everyone to participate, share their stories, share photos if you have them, and we'll hope to go for about an hour with that program. And then after that, on Monday, February 22nd at 6:30, we have our next guest lecture. So our big lecture is going to be a mid-century artist's haven and the early days of the Washington Art Association. And our guest lecturer is Sarah Griswold, the former curator here at the Gunn Historical Museum. And I think you're going to really enjoy that presentation, which really dives deep into the people and the environment that sort of founded the Washington Art Association. Who were these artists and where did they come from? And why did they form that group here in town? It's going to be a fascinating lecture. So please register for these in addition to our other programs that are coming up in March and April and May. You can see them all listed on our website. And you could also register on our website to receive the Zoom links for those. And with that, if there are no other questions, I don't think I see any other hands or comments. I am going to say thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining me this evening.
Thank you.
and Hearing
Thank
about
you.
the events.
Thank you to you, Stephen.
Oh, thank
Lovely
you.
job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
stay
you.
safe, everyone, and stay well.
you.
And we will see you a little bit later next month. Have a good evening.
Susan Schulman, my love to Tessa. This is Susan McMaster.
Oh, hi, Susan.
Hello. Good to hear your voice.
Yes, I'll tell Tessa.
Yeah, I hear my daughter talks about her now and again, and so I think she lives in Florida.
She does, happily.
Good, wonderful. Good to talk to you.
Hi, Nancy and David.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Nancy.
Bye.
Miss you.
Thank you.
Miss you.